23rd Psalm, what does the Lord tell us to do? To lie down in green pastures. And in the 23rd Psalm, who is the Lord? The Lord is my shepherd, and in Him I shall not want. The Lord provides. That is His character. That is His promise. And we are prompted again to consider that question and whether we believe it and whether our lives reflect what we say we believe about that question. Well, with verse 11, Jesus goes ahead and He takes the loaves and He takes the fish and He gives thanks and He begins to distribute them among the people who are seated there. And it's a scene just like a communion meal. And it foreshadows the fact that God will provide us with the thing that we need the most, and that is Jesus. Jesus' life, His death, His resurrection. In a few minutes when we take communion, we'll remember that God provides for us that most important thing, Christ. The Gospel of Mark adds also that Jesus broke the bread, and in the Greek language there that Mark uses, it says that Jesus broke it and kept on giving and giving and giving as it just multiplied each time He broke it into more and more and more. And they found that miraculously, not only did they have enough, but they had more than enough. More than enough of what they needed. Verses 12 and 13 say that they collected 12 baskets of leftovers. Jesus took their finite resources. He took what little they had and He turned it into abundance. He made it more than enough. And when the people realized this, they tried to make Him king. They wanted Him to be their Lord. Now, Jesus knew His path wasn't to become an earthly king, so He resisted. But they were kind of on the right track there. Now, as Jesus trained the disciples in faith, He was testing them and drilling them and trying to get it into their hearts and their minds that living a life of faith is not about having all the answers. It's not about being a perfect person, and it's not about some idea that once you have faith, you don't have problems or needs. Jesus was trying to get them to realize that true faith is exactly the opposite. True faith is realizing that we don't have all the answers, that we don't live a perfect life, that we are people who have problems, that we are people who have needs. True faith is recognizing all of that and trusting that God will provide for us in all of those different ways that we have need. Stewardship is about faith. It's about trusting that if you give God some of what you have, God will provide for you. And it's not just about this idea that if I give God some of my money or I give some of my time to God, that God will just make sure I have enough of those things. It's so much more than that. Because stewardship is about trusting that if I give God something of what I have, God will give me back something infinitely better in return. That God holds something infinitely better than anything that I could ever give to Him. Stewardship is the call to give to God and to trust that He knows better and that His way truly is better for us. But we need to be clear about one thing. God has promised that He will provide for what we need, not what we want. And most of us, living in the culture that we do, we probably need to do some soul searching about that. Because we live in a culture that cannot distinguish wants from needs, and we so easily slip into this idea that we need things that are really just things that we want. And we start expecting God to provide for our wants, and God does not play that game with us. And the problem is that when we start expecting God to meet our wants, when we start feeling there's nothing wrong with things and with money, but when we start feeling entitled to those things, that God should fulfill all of our wants, then we're on shaky ground. Because what we've done in that moment is we've made our happiness, and even more importantly, we've made our faith dependent on getting the things that we want. We've made it dependent on that instead of on God. And when we do that, it only leads us to disappointment. Now, I've a few different times over the years, I've talked to you about the fact that when I was about 19, I got a really horrible intestinal disease. And I was in and out of the hospital, and I had surgery about 5 times over 2 years. And it was just a terrible episode in my life. And there was a time in the midst of all of this that I'd had surgery, and I was just really weak afterwards. I was just really very, very ill following this surgery, and I actually started to bleed out after this surgery. And the doctors and the nurses came rushing in, and they're all trying to stop this bleeding and save my life. And I had this moment where I just became angry at God. And I was saying to God, how could you let this happen, God? I have been faithful through all of this terrible stuff that's happened to me. How can you let this happen? And I looked up at God and I said, if you are not here for me now, then I'm going to know that you don't exist or that you just don't care. And in the desperate moments kind of after that, I had a spiritual experience. I had a vision from God. Only had that happen a couple of times in my life. And it was a complicated thing to explain, but God spoke to me a message in that vision, and it was this. God said 2 things. And the first thing was this: Matt, you might die. But if you do, you will go to be with Jesus. And it's going to be okay. And the other thing that God said to me was, Matt, you might get better here. And if you do, you'll be restored to life, and you'll live your life with me, and it will be okay. You see, what God told me in that moment is, I will provide for you no matter what happens to you. And in just a few minutes, I was filled with this incredible sense of peace. But I want to be really clear about something. I did not get what I wanted. I did not get what I wanted. I wanted to be miraculously healed. I did not want to go through 2 years of suffering and 5 surgeries and all that pain. I didn't want any of that. God did not give me what I wanted. But God did give me what I need. Because I'm here today. I'm healthy. And I have a great family. And I'm the pastor of a great church. God provides. Our call is to trust God and to put our faith in Him, knowing that He will provide for us no matter what happens. Even if the very worst thing happens and you die, God will still be there. God will still provide for you. And every time that we give back to God some of what we have as an act of faith, we prove, not to God, God doesn't need the proof, but we prove to ourselves that we trust God, that our faith is in Him, and we know that He will provide for us no matter what happens in our life. So I want to call each one of us to grow our faith by growing our stewardship, by giving more of ourselves to God, by giving of our time and our talents and our resources, and knowing, trusting, believing that God will provide for us. Amen.